And here we go. We have liftoff.
Propulsion continues to be normal.
R68 chamber pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger, roll, planet.
Water towers fly! Yes!
Tango down to nominal.
Flight downside FD off. Bring in FD off. Off. It's orange! 145!
Oh my god!
Decollage. Put that in the big bag, Eagle.
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
The methane will be igniting in the flare, correct?
Yikes. You dead? Sure. We don't need any more of these.
Good early morning here from Florida, where you're taking a live look at the Falcon 9 at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where SpaceX is ready to launch the Starlink 8-9 mission with 20 Starlink satellites. But this isn't your ordinary Starlink mission. And we'll go into that directly after I introduce everyone that's here. I am Sawyer Rosenstein. I will be your host for this morning's broadcast here. And I am joined, as always, by a fantastic team of techie experts to help along here. My co-host cohorts we'll go with. How about that? Trevor Sesnick, how's it going?
Yeah, it's good. It's certainly not the most ideal time for us in the US, so welcome to all of our Europeans and Australians and whatnot, but glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. And being eaten alive out in the fields right now is Max Evans. Max, how are you hanging in there?
Man, I tell you what, this is exactly why these late night Starlinks do be hitting different. Good morning, everybody, or good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are watching from. And welcome to, besides the mosquitoes, what is rather a beautiful night here, or morning, I should say now, at the Kennedy Space Center.
Yeah, we were hoping this would go a little bit earlier in the morning, but it did push with the targeted liftoff time of 4:55 a.m. Eastern Time. Also providing cam reviews and being eaten alive is D Wise. So D and Max gutting it out for us this early morning, which we very much appreciate. And also joining us, we've got Carson pushing the buttons and pulling the levers. So a reminder, if you have any questions, you could tag us at NASA Spaceflight, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can. So, I did say, this isn't your ordinary Starship launch, or it's not a Starship. This isn't your ordinary Starlink, which, Adrian, I think that needs to be on a t-shirt. But anyway, Trevor, can you kind of explain the difference of the two different types of Starlinks that are going up on this flight?
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, this mission is only carrying 20 Starlink satellites, and that's because 13 of these are the Direct To Cell satellites. So these satellites have more mass on them and are there for communications that allows them to directly act as a cell tower in orbit and communicate with your phone. So that additional hardware makes the 13 of those satellites have a little bit more mass. And then they also deploy them into a little bit higher of an initial orbit. So because of those two things, they go from the standard 23 Starlink satellites down to just 20. So again, 13 of those are direct to cell, and 7 are just standard V2 mini satellites.
Yes, the direct to cell. I remember the big announcement at Starbase with Elon and T-Mobile in the US for all of this. Most of those have been out of Vandenberg so far. So, as mentioned, this launch has pushed a little bit. You could see at one point on there it was 3:59 a.m., now 4:55. While we're talking about numbers, Max, what booster number are we talking about here?
Yeah, so back on the docket for take 2 for flight number 16 is B1073 out there over at Slick 40. And the reason why I say take 2 for flight 16 is because this booster was out there not too long ago. What is it? Between 2 and 3 weeks ago now, getting ready for another Starlink mission. I believe it was 10-3. So 10-2, Trevor? 10-2,
Yep.
thank you. Where it was all getting ready. The vehicle was fully fueled up and ready to go. And once the countdown clock hit T0, they ran into an issue with one of the nine Merlin engines on the first stage, and called for an abort. A very rare hot fire abort, we should say, because that doesn't happen very often. And it's been, I think, around 3 or 4 years since that last happened to Falcon 9. Which may not seem like a terribly long time on the calendar for maybe an aerospace perspective, but considering how often Falcon 9 flies now, it's kind of a big deal when that happens. So they had to destack Falcon 9 and roll this booster back and get it swapped out for another one to carry out that mission. But hopefully that issue has been resolved and the booster is back out there for take 2 for flight number 16.
Yeah, that was very unique. And hey, at least when it did a hot fire, it stayed on the launch pad, unlike a certain country's rocket recently.
Yeah.
China. So, in terms of our downrange fleet here for this booster, flying for the 16th time and hopefully landing for the 16th time, Trevor, what are we looking at?
Yeah, so I think the best looking drone ship is downrange, and my favorite because we will get launch audio or landing audio. It's a Shortfall of Gravitas that the booster will be attempting to land on. That was tugged downrange by Signet Warhorse the First. This is the newer Signet Warhorse vessel that SpaceX is chartering, which has allowed them to just drastically reduce at the marine asset turnaround times for these drone ships. And then for fairing recovery, we have Bob that will be over 600 kilometers downrange and scoop those 2 fairing halves that you can see on your screen right out of the water. So, as a reminder, nowadays, almost every mission SpaceX flies is with a flight-proven fairing half. I believe in 2024, there have only been 3 or 4 launches that have had new fairing halves, and every single other one has been flight proven. And so with some halves flying for up to 20 times and turnaround times of under 2 weeks. So the fairing recovery program is remarkable.
And we're talking over 20 times for these fairing halves, and there are 2 different halves. There is a passive and an active side that help in terms of the separation portion of that flight right after, usually shortly after stage 2 Merlin vacuum ignition. And then they just splash down, they bring them back in, and the other day when I was there for Goes You, I got stuck behind 4 of them in traffic that were just offloaded from 2 back-to-back missions. So, Sawyer flex for the early morning there. Let's take some support here, and then we'll get to some of your questions. Reminder, tag us at NASA Spaceflight. We'll do the best that we can to answer as many of them as we can. We had some earlier ones. Not sure if these were still from SBL, but they're showing up here. So we'll still thank Zeb for becoming a Red Team member. Ironhide Videos and Thomas Smith, both becoming Capcom members. Reminder, Capcom and above gets access to the NSF Discord, where you also get pre- and post-show access to the Flame Trench, our Friday sillier style news show, and occasional random driving streams as well. And Granyo, thank you for becoming a PedRat member as well while we were waiting for the launch this morning. All right, here's a great question. I know the answer, but I want to see if either of you know it for this one. New Normac is asking, and you know what, Max? I'll throw this one to you. If you don't know it, it's fine, but where did the term scrub come from?
Ooh, that's a very good question. But to be honest with you, I'm not sure myself. I would love to hear the answer to that one.
Trevor, do you know it?
I have absolutely no idea.
So, back in the day, when they were putting up launches, you had a launch board. You know, now we get emails and there's spreadsheets and stuff, and the next spaceflight app that kind of have listed what's next. But they would write them on like a whiteboard or a chalkboard. And so, if the mission ended up getting delayed and not happening, they would have to scrub the board, like actually scrub it in terms of cleaning it. So, that is where we got the term scrub for rocket launches.
That makes total sense.
Random fun facts for you at 4 a.m. Eastern time here. Here's one. Okay, first off, the name is brilliant. and I'm gonna throw it to you, Max. Sod this, give me a beer. Asking jellyfish question mark?
Great username, by the way. But at this hour, we don't think so. However, if this for any reason, I mean, fingers crossed that it doesn't, so everyone can go home and get some more sleep here. If this does end up pushing to the very end of the window, you enter in, I believe, just under 1 hour before sunrise, which is a very rare occurrence here to launch before sunrise, as opposed to sunset here. But TLDR, if it pushes toward the very end of the window, there is a high probability of a pretty good jellyfish. But at the moment, at the current T0, I do not believe so.
Let's hope not. That's, I think, the big thing here.
Yeah, I think for once, let's hope not. And D and I were actually talking about this earlier before the T0s kept slipping toward the end of the window. We're like, a jellyfish would be nice tonight, but I think just for the sake of our sanity, let's just get it off the ground as soon as possible.
Exactly. At this hour, let's see a nice, beautiful launch, see this booster go back into rotation again after...
I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm not sure if we've specified, by the way, but the launch window is open until 5:59 local. So they have just about an hour left in the launch window that they can slip the T0 if they need. But please, SpaceX, please don't do that.
That also brings up another point, because, we have the Firefly NSF stream that hopefully we will get Firefly off the ground very soon. By we, I mean the Firefly company getting Alpha flying. But the last attempt, they had to abort pretty much near the end of the count, and they were attempting to recycle for 30 minutes later, because they had a 30-minute window. SpaceX doesn't have that ability because of the way that they load fuel, right, Trevor?
Yeah, so Firefly uses on their Alpha vehicle liquid oxygen and RP1, just like on Falcon 9. However, the liquid oxygen that they use is a little bit warmer than what SpaceX uses. And this has advantages and disadvantages. So the main advantage is, since it's just a little bit below the boiling temperature, if it warms up, it just boils off, you vent it, and you can replenish that liquid oxygen. However,
the fill and flow for SpaceX, man.
yeah. However, for SpaceX, they want that liquid oxygen to be, on the order of 20 degrees centigrade cooler. And so substantially under the boiling point of liquid oxygen, and actually closer to the freezing point of liquid oxygen. And what this allows them to do is this increases the density of the propellant, which has two main effects. The first is obviously if your density is higher, then you can fit more propellant into the same tanks. But secondly, if your propellant density is higher, you actually get more performance out of your engines too. So it's kind of like a double win. So this is something that SpaceX decided to do on both their Falcon program and their Starship program. And that means, at least on Falcon, that they do not have time for a recycle at all. So back in the day, before they did this super chilling, you would see Falcon 9, with similar recycle capabilities to basically every other rocket. But since they transitioned to this colder propellant, they lost that opportunity. So now I imagine a lot of people are wondering, if they do super chill LOX and methane on Starship, why are they able to hold for like half an hour on Starship but not Falcon? And my best guess would probably just be that, right, Starship's surface area to mass or to volume ratio is substantially lower. So it's going to be losing heat propellant the propellant is going to be losing energy or gaining energy at a lower rate, just because there's less surface area to absorb heat from.
And there you go. It's a really neat comparison of how they've evolved, being able to get this quickly fueled and go, but also at the same time made the improvements with the methane and LOX for Starship. Now, I've seen a couple of questions here about asking where they can see the launch, if it's visible over Florida, where the drone ship is located. I believe we have a fancy schmancy graphic that'll be able to help us out with that. And there is your trajectory for this flight. As has been the case recently now, they've swapped from southeasterly launches, which given a Hurricane Beryl is probably not a bad thing at the moment, and are continuing northeast on this one. And as mentioned, Shortfall of Gravitas is hanging out downrange, ready to catch the booster. And then you see that second mark for the fairing recovery vessel as well. Now, Max, I know it is super buggy out there, as we see where Stage 2 is going to kind of burn up there near Australia and New Zealand. You just came back from New Zealand recently and are now getting eaten alive by the bugs, but besides the bugs, how's the actual weather out there?
Yeah, we did, and I don't think we've had much of a chance to talk about it yet, unfortunately. But the weather, I mean, it is now winter there because they, of course, are in the southern hemisphere compared to the U.S. and Florida, of course, being in the northern hemisphere. So these seasons are opposite. And winter for them, at least from our experience in that time, was around mid to low 60 degrees Fahrenheit range, high 50 degree Fahrenheit. Not quite sure what that is in C. I think around 10 degrees C. So honestly, it wasn't terrible, and it wasn't that humid out either. But it swapped back and forth from rain to sun like way more often than it does here in Florida. And we thought the weather here was pretty bipolar at times, but it was bonkers how much it was switching down there. Maybe that's just a seasonal thing, but right now here at the moment it is about 82 or 83 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's absolutely not a single breath of wind. So all these mosquitoes and these critters flying around are just absolutely thriving. But if you try to ignore the sound of them buzzing in your ear, it is eerily quiet out here tonight, and especially with no moon out.
There you go. And the official forecast posted earlier by the 45th Weather Squadron is that we are currently 80% go. That means there is only a 20% probability of violating weather constraints. It's a little backwards, it seems like, on those, but that is the percentage of violation. So inverse it to 100, and there you go. 80% go. Everything looks pretty good on that. And that is the only date that they currently have listed there, as after that, we then get to the 4th of July. We are getting close to a significant milestone here in the countdown as we near the T-minus 40-minute mark, when hopefully they will begin polling to see if they are ready to go for propellant load. And if so, the launch director will verify that at T-minus 38 minutes, followed 3 minutes later by the loading of fuel, starting off with both the RP-1, Rocket Propellant 1, in the first stage, a refined form of kerosene, along with the liquid oxygen or LOX. Meanwhile, stage 2 will start with just the RP-1 load before having our favorite LOX chill down, aka the best vent, followed a few minutes later by stage 2 LOX load begin. So we will keep an eye out for that. Hopefully SpaceX gives an update whether they are go or not for the current T0 of 455. Here's an interesting question, Trevor. I want your thoughts on this. Altair is asking, what are your expectations for the amount of Falcon 9 launches in 2024, as we're now more than halfway through the year?
Ooh, this is, yeah, a good question. And I want to start this answer with Alex wrote a like 3,300 word overview of SpaceX's second quarter this year, which is published on our website, nasaspaceflight.com, where he kind of talks about this a little bit. So right now, if you look at the number of days into the year that we are versus how many launches, right? They're right about at that 135 Falcon launch rates, somewhere in there. However, if you compare this to the estimate from Q1, that was closer to 125. So this just goes to show it's not, a constant launch cadence that they have, that they are continually increasing this. So if you take that into account, they're looking pretty good for that 148 launch goal. In fact, the other day on X, John Edwards responded to someone noting that they may even try to do a few extra launches this year, highlighting that a few more than 148 Falcon launches. So it's going to be hard, of course. I think it is remarkable how the SpaceX teams have done so far. I mean, look at that graph that's on, or that chart on screen right now. Like, SpaceX is accounting for about 55% of all orbital launch attempts, which is crazy. So yeah, I think they're looking very good for this goal. My personal opinion is that they're probably going to hit right around 145. Um, Hopefully they'll get a few more so that they can reach that 148 launch goal, though.
That, I mean, that would be absolutely amazing. They are keeping up the pace. Again, you saw that article. I linked it in chat. Also available at nasaspaceflight.com. And there are the numbers already. Falcon launching 67 missions in the first 6 months of 2024, which is staggering to think of that number, especially now that we're in July. And we already have the pace starting to pick up again a little bit with Vandy launches and here as well. So again, we should hopefully, we should know that if they have the go or no go for fuel load shortly, and if so, we will keep an eye out for frost on the rocket. And that would be starting at T-minus 35 minutes. In fact, we just have an update from SpaceX while we were already on their page. Posting on X saying launch team has pulled go for propellant load ahead of tonight's Falcon 9 launch of 20 Starlink satellites. That's what we love to hear.
That is exactly what I want to hear.
Yes, we definitely want that. Here's a question, Max, because we showed, trajectory and things like that. We don't really talk about sound as often. Gadzooks is wondering how far will the sound go? They're in Daytona wondering if they'll hear it at all for their first in-person launch.
Ooh, Daytona is pretty far north, but it's not so far north that I would completely rule out at least hearing some kind of like thunderous rumble in the sky, even though it may sound incredibly distant. But I've never actually seen or heard a launch from that distance, so I unfortunately cannot say with certainty that the sound will or will not reach you. But keep your eyes perked for sure, because your ears, excuse me. You never know, because over here in Florida, even if you're say 10 or 15 miles north or south of the launch pad, depending on what trajectory it's flying, whether it be northeast or southeast. The rocket can be heard for a very, very long time, like well past Miko, just due to the way the sound waves behave in the lower and upper atmospheres. You just hear it for a very long time. It's remarkable. But up in Daytona, I'm not quite sure. But as I said earlier, please keep your ears perked. You never know.
Definitely.
That's one thing that
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say. That was one thing I was amazed by when I heard, not saw a Starship fly, was you could really hear it for like basically 6 minutes. 5-6 minutes with both booster and ship, which was quite cool.
And what's weird about Starship too is that Starship sounds nothing like any other rocket currently flying. If anything, the sound is more similar to, oh hey, look at that, a crescent moon rising just to the right of LC-39A. Neat. The sound of Starship compares more to, I would say, the SRBs on SLS than Falcon 9 or Atlas V, anything else. Just it's so bizarre. The pitch is different, the tone is different, and the amount of sheer crackle that you get in the exhaust sound too is like nothing else out there. So if anyone ever has a chance to go catch Starship fly out of Starbase, and hopefully out of Florida soon enough, you can hear that for yourself. But it's remarkable.
There really is nothing like it, that is for sure. So again, go out there. If you feel a slight rumble or hear this kind of like crackling, rumbling noise, then you'll catch a little bit of it, hopefully, as it goes that way. And if you do capture pictures and or video, send them to our social media team via messages on Facebook or Instagram, even tag on TikTok, anything like that, or just tag us at NASA Spaceflight on X. So, all of those ways, and I'm sure our social team loves to see those, because I know I do. And there is that crescent moon that Max was just talking about, as fueling should be underway now for Falcon 9. I do want to take a moment here and thank some people who've been on a gifting spree here throughout the stream at this crazy hour. Telstar86, thank you for gifting a Red Team membership. Paul McFadden, thank you for gifting 5 Red Team memberships. And another 5 Red Team memberships, 10 in total. And then Vincenzo and Uhe, welcome to Padrat membership. Now here's another question. Trevor, I want to pose this one to you, because we've heard about it, but we haven't seen it yet. What's the situation with larger Falcon fairings?
Yeah, we really don't have a great idea with that, right? We saw NASA had I think it was NASA had the press release probably like a year ago at this point when they were doing the environmental chamber testing thing, where they basically, I think it's simultaneously they do testing in a vacuum, and then also do a bunch of testing for like different radio frequencies of what interference is or isn't there. Is the payload successfully protected from frequencies between certain ranges and whatnot? Um, that was the last update we saw, and we got a few photos of it there. I think it's really one of the things where it's not really needed yet. So if it's not really needed, SpaceX is going to kind of be a little bit slower about it. But as soon as there is a Falcon Heavy mission that will need those extended fairings, I bet we'll rapidly see them iterated upon and then launched.
There you go. So in the true SpaceX time, soon, TM.
I'd say so.
Okay, here. We also have one from Kyler, and I'll keep this one with you, Trevor. They're wondering, is Starlink and Falcon 9 launch cadence getting close to the theoretical maximum due to each group's final orbital requirements? My guess would be no, given how they only up there for about 5 years-ish for each little satellite. Maybe? What do you think?
Yeah, first of all, I want to just point out it looks like we have frost on
Ah,
the booster, which is what we are very happy to see. So that shows that fuel load is underway. As SpaceX said, they pulled go for, so that was expected. Anyway, getting back to the question. So I'm not super sure exactly what you mean by the theoretical max due to each group's final orbital requirements, because um, if you're getting at, right, there's a finite number of satellites that SpaceX needs to put up. Sure, it's finite, but SpaceX has talked about putting like up to like 42,000 satellites into low Earth orbit. And some of those are going to be in extraordinarily low orbits, meaning that the satellite lifespan will be a lot shorter. Um, so with all of this said, don't think there's ever going to be a time where we're not seeing a large number of Starlink launches, just because they'll need to keep replacing satellites. That said, even at their current pace, they're nowhere near the theoretical max. They are never going to be there until Starship is up and running and is rapidly reusable, in my opinion.
yeah, I mean, that's honestly a good point there. I feel like, I don't know, my brain just totally stopped working there. No, there we go, I just remembered. Yeah, I feel like at this point, the satellites keep coming down, they're gonna keep going up, and yes, the one thing that we're lacking right now in space is space, ironically, at least in low Earth orbit. But they have this planned out. As you mentioned, they've kind of worked it out with the FAA. You've got teams all across the globe tracking where all of these satellites are to avoid crashing into each other and debris and things like that. So I think between all of those, we are not close to reaching the maximum on those yet. Here's a question from the 20-minute vent, even though we're not to you just yet. I will take your question now still. They want to know, Max, can SpaceX insulate the tanks on Falcon 9?
They sure could, and that was actually toyed with in Falcon 9's early design back when it was first flying. But of course, insulation on the tanks, of course, adds weight, and weight on a rocket is something you want as little of as possible. And also, that is part of the reason why SpaceX also has implemented a load and go fueling process, because Falcon 9 cannot hold simply because of the amount of boil off and propellant that it needs to keep in the tanks at one time. Especially with the RP1 being super chilled as it is, to stay as dense as possible, to fit as much of it in the tanks as possible. They need to do that in order to get as much performance out of both the tanks and the engines as they possibly can. So insulation would certainly help with the boil off problem that plagues most rockets, just as a natural phenomenon. But it will add a decent amount of weight on both tanks as well, and the prospect of that, I think, is enough to keep the load and go fueling procedure alive for just a little bit longer. Maybe a good idea in practice, but I think it is not in the appetite for SpaceX at the moment.
There you go. Weight, very important. Also, part of the reason why, for those just joining, as we hit 27 minutes, we are only launching 20 Starlink satellites on this particular mission, with 13 of them being the Direct To Cell satellites and 7 of the traditional V2 minis that we're used to seeing SpaceX launch at this point. Here's a question, interestingly, from Captain Misaki. They're wondering, Max, do you think these ships will ever get actual names? Because apparently it's bad luck for ships to go without them. I think the booster number is probably just what's going to stick at the rate they're pumping these out, right?
Like Starship, just to be clear, Starship?
I'm not sure if they mean Starship or Falcon, but could be. Let's take it both ways. How about that?
I mean, for Falcon 9, just the simple booster serial numbers. Excuse me, what are words? I think that will suffice for pretty much Falcon 9's entire operational life. But for Starship, I imagine once it becomes operational and they have the differing variants of ship flying, maybe they will go about naming the ones that, of course, are of the reusable side or front. I cannot word tonight. Words are so difficult.
You're
Perks
not
of
alone.
a 4:30 a.m. Starlink mission. I would not rule it out. Similar, obviously, to the way NASA had named the space shuttles and all of the lunar landers and command modules with Apollo. I find it very difficult to believe that they won't at some point. You know.
And along those lines, you have the Dragon capsules that get, as they clarified in chat, the quote-unquote legit names.
Correct. Yes. Even though, honestly, those names are hardly ever referred to. Well, internally, the Dragon capsules are hardly ever referred to as those names. Of course, they have their own numbers as well. But at some point, they have to. At least that's where. At least that's what my gut says.
Oh, absolutely. Plus, when we get to the Artemis program and HLS, I feel like anything that's going to be launching a human or landing a human on the moon with Starship is going to have a cool name.
And even Starliner now with Calypso.
True. That's a whole nother ball of worms that we're not going to touch. Or can of worms, whatever the saying is. Let's see. This is actually a really interesting question, and I don't think we even know the answer to this, but I'm going to throw it to you anyway, Trevor. Brandon wants to know, how does SpaceX decide when enough is enough on a booster?
So this is a good question, and at least for Block 5 so far, it seems like they haven't really hit that point. The only time they've expended a booster, they have a Falcon 9 mission that needs an expended booster, and Right, the one that obviously makes the most sense to expend is the oldest booster in the fleet. And oldest in terms of serial number wise, because the older serial numbers are just slower to turn around. And, SpaceX learned a lot from several hundred Falcon 9 Block 5 missions at this point that you can imagine. They've made a lot of small changes to the newer ones to just make it easier to refurbish, more powerful, and whatnot. Um, so I don't think we really know exactly when SpaceX decides is enough because, right, we've seen that originally Falcon 9 Block 5, the first stages were supposed to only launch 10 times. And then SpaceX was expecting to, do massive refurbishment to them. And here we are on a flight that's a booster flying for its 16th time, which honestly doesn't 16 flights at this point seems like it's not a new booster, but it's also not like an old booster. Um, and SpaceX is now going for that 40 mark, that 40 flight goal without any major refurbishment. So it's that's something that we're going to have to pay attention to. But Block 5 has performed very well in uh, the in the refurbishment sense so far.
Exactly. And the fact that we see now a booster fly 22 times and return back into port, it still blows my mind that that's the legit number now, and that something that's 16, 17 flights is kind of middle-aged at this point. Let's thank here Paul McFadden. Thank you for gifting 5 Red Team memberships. Really appreciate all the gifted subs tonight. If you did get one, definitely give him a thank you, and check out the member section, see some of the cool perks that you also get, including some awesome pictures from Starbase quite frequently. And Kyler here, while we're talking about the names, I agree with this one completely. Rooting for HLS to be named Starship Enterprise. I mean, how could they not, right?
I feel like that has to be a staple at some point, whether it be for one of the crew the commercial crew missions that I'm sure SpaceX will do at some point, or for HLS. But I feel like at some point that has to be a staple.
Exactly. It's science fiction literally coming to life. So I would hope they would do that. And the fact that in the show it's the Starship Enterprise and we finally have a vehicle that's legit named Starship. Oh, I think Elon and the team down at Brownsville there and over in California are smart enough to figure that out. You could see there some of that frostiness around the vehicle, a lot of it kind of just lingering in the air, which may make things a little bit tricky to see, but we are now only about 15 seconds away from not just any vent, the best vent, the T-minus 20-minute and 20-second vent. Trevor, as it begins, can you kind of tell us what we're actually seeing now?
Yeah, of course. So the T-minus 20-minute vent is simply that the second stage of Falcon is loaded in 2 stages. So as you mentioned earlier, on Falcon, they have the liquid oxygen be super chilled. And to keep it as cold as possible, they want to load it as late as possible. So therefore, they don't start loading it until about that T-minus 16-minute mark. And since they don't start loading it until T-minus 16 minutes, they don't start chilling down the lines until about T-minus 20 minutes and 20 seconds. So what this vent is just SpaceX running a little bit of, we think it's liquid oxygen through the line to cool it down ahead of stage 2 liquid oxygen load, which will begin in 3.5 minutes.
And also giving you a really good idea of the weather and the Florida air there at the moment, you could see the vent kind of just lingering. Typically, that will usually look almost like a cape or be blowing sideways. That will indicate if it's windy or not, and if it's not super humid, it's a much thinner, more concentrated type of purge. Whereas this one, you could see not super windy and very humid, so it's kind of just encapsulating the bottom of the rocket there. Yeah. This vent tells you a lot about Florida, and poor Max and D is all I can say. So, regardless of the humidity and everything, I mean, East Coast, Best Coast, but 21 Volts Gaming does want to know, Trevor, even though it won't go into operation for a while, has there been any activity on Slick 6?
Not that we know of, I don't think. I think we're still in the phase of ULA kind of decommissioning their parts on the pad. And then hopefully sooner than later, SpaceX will be taking over and starting work for that Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy pad on the West Coast. But yeah, I bet that pad's first SpaceX launch is several years out still. Like, building pads is not easy.
The biggest thing being that GSE, the ground support equipment, and also the fact you're talking about Delta, which is very different propellant-wise from something like Starship and even Falcon 9. There's differences in the temperatures that things were kept. You also had the cryogenic upper stage, so it also had hydrogen lines. So there's a lot that needs to be reworked up there for any of SpaceX's fleet of vehicles at Slick 6. Now this vent, by the way, will continue on likely for about another minute and 20 seconds or so. And once we do that, or see that, excuse me, we will know that they have begun loading the liquid oxygen onto stage 2. Meanwhile, as mentioned, RP1 and the liquid oxygen on the first stage are continuing to load. Here's a question from Old Jobo, and Max, I'm going to throw this one to you, because it's a really good question that I think people don't realize the answer to. They want to know how far away from the launch site is a night launch visible?
Ooh, and see, that is one of the beautiful things about Falcon 9 or any other rocket in particular, especially a Keralox rocket flying at night, is that the exhaust is so bright you can see it from very far distances. So, just in Florida for the first 2.5 minutes of flight, you can see it all the way on the west coast of Florida, all the way over in the Tampa Clearwater area. It's easily visible over there on the horizon. You can also go about 3 or 4 hours south, up and down the East Coast, and still have a great view of it, although the flight path will determine how much of it you actually see. But also, we've seen plenty of pictures and videos from people in South Carolina, North Carolina, even all the way up to New England, who have seen Falcon 9's second stage flying on northeast flight paths, which is remarkable. So it just depends on where you are and what time of day it's actually flying, and that will determine exactly how far away you can see it. But generally speaking, you can see it from very, very far away. And D is pointing out the back channel that they've watched a northeast flight path from the Everglades, which is not close. For those of you who are not familiar with the geography of Florida, the Everglades are all the way at and pretty much as far south as you can get in Florida, and the launch was still visible. So, I would like to say across pretty much almost the entire state of Florida.
Oh, easily, yeah. I mean, where I am, which is 150 miles south, it's clearly visible. My parents are about 200 miles south, clearly visible there. I've got a friend a little further south, Karen, who, by the way, raising her toddler right, taking her out to see these rocket launches, can see it from closer to like 200 miles away, 225 miles away. So it's a pretty far distance. And then again, with these, considering that it is going northeasterly, there's a good chance you can get some clear views all the way up into the Carolinas for something like this. Let's see, 21 Volts Gaming. I don't know if we know the exact specs, Trevor, but it definitely seems a bit smaller. Do we know how much smaller the Slick 40 Crew Access Tower is compared to 39A?
I certainly don't. That's a great question.
It definitely appears smaller, because if you're unaware of the launchpad situation out there, 39A is big. It is surprisingly very big. The fact, keep in mind, you have an entire fixed service structure, you've got a flame trench, and still room for a Starship tower, and at one point the legs that would have held an orbital launch mount. That's massive. Slick 40 is tiny in comparison. Sure, you've got the rocket, you've got the flame trench underneath it, you've got a much shorter distance, even, from the launch area to the horizontal integration facility there. And yeah, it's a lot smaller. So I guess to kind of make it fit, it does appear to be on the smaller side, but I don't think we know exact measurements. But that is a really good question.
I think probably the easiest way to put that is the crew access tower at 40 is just as big as it needs to be because it was built bespokely for like 40 and Falcon 9 and Dragon, whereas SpaceX inherited the FSS or the fixed service structure over at 39A, which is a much larger launch complex as a whole. So they were able to modify that as they please. But the actual crew access tower at 40, they built customly to fit Falcon 9 and Dragon just as it needed to.
Can I
Yeah.
say a hot take?
Oh god, does it involve
for
Taylor
it.
Swift?
No, it does not.
Okay, then yes.
FSS is just an annoying and silly name. Like, it's a tower. We don't need to make it sound pretentious by giving it some acronym. It's a tower.
Chris Bergen would be very upset with you.
Well, you know part of why it has that name.
I mean, I know it's like because of shuttle era
Yes.
stuff, but
Shuttle, absolutely. Of course, haven't gotten to talk about that yet.
it's just a
That's because-
tower.
Well, there were two structures. That's why. There was the fixed service structure, which is the
Yeah.
part that doesn't move, and there was a rotating service structure that, as it implies, rotated backwards away as they rolled the vehicle to the pad, then closed around the shuttle so they could work inside the payload bay at the pad, and then obviously retracted about 24 hours before a scheduled launch. So when you had two different types of service structures, one fixed, one rotating, you kind of differentiate the two, and the name has just stuck. So don't go dissing my shuttle history here with your hot takes, okay?
I'm probably fired anyway for saying I don't like a shuttle era name.
Yeah, it was nice knowing you. There's someone in chat, I believe it's Kevin Mikalrayed, I think it's pronounced, saying Trevor with the bad takes as always.
Kevin, shouldn't you be sleeping? Don't you have a launch to prepare for?
Yeah, this one.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't know if he stayed awake or is just waking up for it, but we are now 11 minutes away from that scheduled liftoff time, and Kevin Michael Reed confirming yes, he should be sleeping. But there's rockets. How can you sleep when there are rockets getting ready to launch out at the pad here? Again, Falcon 9, Slick 40, Starlink 8-9 mission with only 20 satellites this time, but 13 of them, making this not your ordinary Starlink flash, being the Direct To Cell satellites that, as we described earlier, basically turns a satellite into a cell phone tower to help improve your signal. And while we have just a moment here, I do want to point out that years ago, when cell phones were coming out, I was telling my mom that it's amazing all that has to happen with the internet and with these cell phones because they have to bounce off the satellite to get to your phone. And she believed it because it was a joke. But now it turns out it's becoming reality. So I will eat my own words there.
Did you just say that cell phones started coming out, quote, years ago?
I'm being nice. I'm also going with when my family started using cell phones, which was 2005. So
That's more than years ago.
you're just trying to make me feel old, aren't you?
That's almost decades ago.
Kids these days. Anyway. Max, I know you're getting eaten alive out there as we come up on 9.5 minutes, and you've got some work to do to set up your cameras. One final check-in with you with the weather before we go. How's everything looking?
Looking just about as perfect as you can get. There's some clouds washing over our area, but they are of no threat. They are just a nuisance for viewing, but they are small by comparison to the rest of the sky. Of course, obviously, it is a crystal clear sky out here with no moon, so the sky is filled with tons of stars. So I think weather is going to be on the upside for launch. So it was great talking to you, gentlemen, and I will see y'all on the other side.
Absolutely, good luck, and yes, we will talk to you after the launch. Here's actually a really good question from Gadzooks, because we don't really talk about this often on these streams. They want to know, how tall is the rocket and how large are the Starlink satellites?
Ooh, that is a good question. So the Falcon rocket is 70 meters tall, which, by the way, is the same height as the booster of Starship. So Starship is just a completely different scale. And the vehicle's diameter is like 3.66 meters, or what is that in feet? About 10 feet, right? Um, a little over 10 feet.
Something like
A-
that, yeah.
yeah. And so these satellites, these Starlink satellites, are basically built to perfectly take up that payload fairing, which has a diameter of 5.2 meters. So I would say um, the satellites are probably on the order of 4.5 meters long. Um, so somewhere in that size. I don't think we have a perfect answer to that. And then, of course, once they're on orbit, they unfold their solar panel, or two solar panels on these Starlink V2, and that obviously makes them a good amount larger.
Right, and just for reference as well, for those satellites, each one has a mass of about, I believe, 750 kilograms or so. Like, little
Yeah,
700
we're
British
thinking
pounds.
about 730 for the V2 variants at this point. And then the direct to cell are probably like 750, 780, somewhere in there, but we really don't have a good idea.
What we do have a good idea of, though, as we pass past T minus 7 minutes, is that the engine chill should be underway on the rocket. And I believe you also have the answer as to why they chill the engines.
I do have the answer to that. The reason why they do this is because Florida is very warm, and not just Florida, the environment in general. Air is very warm when you compare it to that of liquid oxygen. So right now, or before the engine chill begins, right, those 9 Merlin engines on the first stage are going to be right at about that, what Max said, it's like 80 out, so 25, 30 centigrade um, temperature. And liquid oxygen that SpaceX uses is about negative 210 degrees centigrade. So what would happen if they didn't chill it down? As soon as some of the liquid oxygen contacted the engine, it would flash into a vapor, rapidly expanding in volume, causing cavitation, a hard start, and a whole bunch of other not so fun effects. And that they want to avoid. You don't really want your engine to hard start. So they chill down those engines. They run a little bit of liquid oxygen through the LOX turbo pump to chill them down. And that makes it so that they're able to be ignited at that T minus 2.7 second mark.
Obviously, very important if we want this thing to launch, and hopefully, we don't have a repeat of the last time this booster flew, in which we were just about to get to that point and it was aborted within the final 10 seconds there.
We got to that point.
Right. Yep.
Um,
There's also a quick question from Kevin Michael Reed saying, why isn't LOX frozen? It's very cold. Density, my friend. Density. We are kind of on the 4.5 minute mark here, which should begin the retraction of the strongback, that upright metallic structure behind that tower there that helps transport the rocket and erect it vertical, sometimes called the TE. Why do we lean it back these 1.8 degrees?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is just SpaceX preparing the TE at this point. So to begin, right, the TE provides a lot of structural support for Falcon, and is what erects it from being horizontal into that vertical position. since launching your rocket horizontally is not ideal. So for that, right, they want the TE to be very close to the vehicle. However, for launch, when you have 9 Merlin engines firing at roughly a meganewton each, you really don't want your TE to be close to the vehicle. So what they do is they begin pressurization of the tanks for that retract. And then once the vehicle is structurally sound, they begin that initial retract of 1.8 degrees, like you were saying. And then after all engines ignite and the vehicle has lifted off, the TE falls from that 1.8 degrees retracted to well over 45 degrees. And this just helps make sure that it's as far away from the vehicle as possible, minimizing refurbishment. And this is something that we see on most launch pads, right? Actually, just today, I think, we got to see Blue Origin doing some testing of their TE at Slick. Is it LC36 or Slick 30? It's LC36, right? So yeah, pretty standard procedure and very exciting to see.
It really is.
Stage
Yes,
1
over
launch
at
load
30
complete.
seconds. And as we hit the 2.5-minute mark now, you hear stage 1 liquid oxygen loading is completed. So we will be waiting for the stage 2 liquid oxygen load to complete, and we will also get indication of that by a vent once again, although this time, instead of cooling down the lines to prepare them for the flow of the colder liquid oxygen, it's actually being used instead to purge the line of any potential remaining liquid oxygen or gases in there that could potentially be flammable and dangerous as 9 Merlin engines fly by. We are now under 2 minutes here. So we will keep an eye out for that. We'll also keep the ear up for the calls from SpaceX, because the next one after we hear about
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
Which there it is. We will then hopefully hear Falcon 9 entering startup, meaning the onboard computers will take control of the countdown at that point. And then at T-minus 45 seconds, we should expect a go for launch, hopefully, from the launch director. And some of these audio calls may be on a slight delay from what you see on
Ground gas
screen.
closeouts has started.
That's just the way the SpaceX sends their feed. And there is that final vent coming up on that 1-minute mark. And I promise you, we will be quiet once we get flying with Falcon 9 so you can hear the sound. Waiting for the call.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Here we go. Onboard computers have control. In addition, the tanks are also being pressurized to their final flight pressures. We are hoping to hear that go for launch next.
Go for launch.
And we have that go for launch as we now reach T-minus 30 seconds until liftoff. At the base of the rocket, you will start to see the rainbirds first, so you'll see some water pouring down, potentially a green flash as the T-tab ignites the 9 Merlin engines, and then once we hit 0, it should fly off the pad. So we're now about 10 seconds away, so keep an eye out for all of those items. Ignition. And liftoff of Starlink 8-9, adding direct to cell launches now from Florida. Go Starlink V2 minis and direct to cell, go. Amazing crackle still rumbling there as vehicle has indeed passed through max Q, maximum aerodynamic pressure, pushing against the rocket.
Now we get to see all the beautiful colors of the Carolox exhaust at night. A little bit of blue, and then as it goes up into upper atmosphere, we'll see a little bit more blue.
It's absolutely gorgeous, and we'll also see that plume spread a bit more as it gets into the thinner parts of the atmosphere.
And even a little bit of purple in that other camera view.
I mean, absolutely gorgeous as always here. And what we will also hopefully see as always is 3 events in rapid succession coming up within the next 15 seconds or so. Starting with MECO, main engine cutoff, when the 9 Merlin 1D engines will shut down, followed by first and second stage separation, and then ignition of the Merlin vacuum engine on stage 2, known as SES-1. So there's MECO.
There it is. You could see very clearly in that view the staggered shutdown sequence of the Merlin engines.
We will have separation and ignition. Here's the view from SpaceX's feed, a couple seconds behind our cameras. And there we go, ignition of stage 2. That is what we want to see, a normal-sized Merlin vacuum nozzle. And then you've got the grid fins that'll be extending on that first stage, which will now work its way down to a Shortfall of Gravitas, the drone ship located about 620 kilometers to the northeast of where it took off. Still absolutely beautiful views from it now here. Should also have fairing separation coming up momentarily. We'll see if we end up seeing those as we go through, but those, as mentioned earlier as well, will then splash down once they separate with the assistance of parachutes and some small gas jet thrusters on their way to be recovered and flown again.
Yeah, the fairings were deployed at T plus 3 minutes, so that happened a good bit ago already.
All right. And those will continue to make their way back to Earth. I believe that takes approximately 40 to 45 minutes.
Yeah, certainly a lot longer than the booster.
That is for sure. And then on the bottom left there, you can see the numbers from that first stage. The speed going down, the altitude continuing to go up. It typically peaks at its highest point at around 118-ish kilometers. And after that, it's all downhill from there in a good way. You can also see those little puffs there. Those are the cold gas jet thrusters to help it, right, Trevor?
Yeah, so when it's right, you can see in the bottom left, the booster's actually just passed through its apogee and it's on its way down. So at 100 and whatever kilometers, there's essentially no air. And what I mean by that is even though if you're trying to orbit something at that altitude, which obviously would not work, the grid fins have zero control authority. So in the upper atmosphere, they use these RCS thrusters, which you can see there are 2 pods on either side for all attitude control. And then also they use those RCS thrusters for propellant settling before the landing, before the entry burn. Once they're through that entry burn, which again, that entry burn will be the fairly standard profile that we see on these missions, where it'll start with igniting that center E9 engine before igniting side engines E1 and E5. Before they, or after that, they'll start transitioning from mainly using these RCS thrusters for attitude control to using the grid fins. And that's when we'll start to see the grid fins really be able to bite into the atmosphere to rotate the vehicle. And then, of course, there will be one more burn after that entry burn, the landing burn, which will hopefully take B-1073 onto a Shortfall of Gravitas' deck, completing its flight, which again, this booster is flying for its 16th time.
There's that settling that you were talking about with those thrusters ahead of the entry burn, which should be starting up
Stage
momentarily.
1 FTS is saved.
And there is said entry burn using fighting fire with fire to help slow itself down as it works its way towards a Shortfall of Gravitas. that view never gets old. And the fact that prior to that, we were also able to see the sunrise there. Look at that. You can see it on the horizon, I believe, from our team at the Cape. That is the entry burn. Beautiful. Also beautiful there, you can see the curvature of the Earth, the sunrise working its way towards the west. Absolutely gorgeous views. At this point, the next two events are the landing burn, where hopefully it will touch down successfully on a shortfall of gravitas. It's only 15 kilometers up from the deck right now, and that'll be followed shortly after by SECO 1, second engine cutoff 1, the shutdown of the Merlin vacuum engine. Falcon 9's first stage getting a little wiggly there, Trevor. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yeah. A little sparky right now with as it starts to enter that highest heating regime. Well, it's through it at this point, but pay attention to the bottom left telemetry. At about a kilometer above sea level is when we'll start to see that speed rapidly decline as they ignite the engine. There it is.
There's the ignition. You'll see the grid fins now actually working their magic here.
Stage 2 is in terminal guidance.
Sound from the drone ship.
Bullseye.
Touchdown.
Stage 2
16
FPS
flights
is saved.
in the books.
And
So
that is
now-
SpaceX's 253rd consecutive booster landing and 327th overall.
And it keeps the perfect record going as well for a shortfall of gravitas in terms of its catches.
Yeah.
And there's
And back
SECO
shut down.
1. Shutting down that Merlin vacuum engine. There is an additional burn that will happen at T plus 51 minutes and will last a whopping 1 second approximately before deploying about 10 minutes after that. And that's what we love to see, an empty pad. That was pretty impressive from our views. Max, how was it from you?
You know, I am in the middle of eating my own words, and I feel so sorry for the viewer who asked if there was a potential for a jellyfish tonight, and I just flat out said no, because that was completely incorrect. Dee and I were both shocked. We were just following stage 2, and all of a sudden the plume just started to gradually light up, and I'm eating my own words. We had a fat jellyfish here tonight, boys and girls. It was absolutely beautiful, and that's all I'm caught up in right now. But in terms of the actual experience itself, prior to that, in liftoff, gorgeous as always. And because the air tonight is super thick and super humid, it carried the reverb of the sound energy from Falcon 9 very, very, very well. And it was pounding us in the chest as much as it ever could. And the skies are also clearing up now very, very well, and we had a view all the way up, pretty much all the way up until SECO 1. So, beautiful night for a launch and business as usual for SpaceX. But I do feel very, again, I'm flat out eating my own words. We had a fat jellyfish here tonight, boys and girls, like a fat one, like it was huge.
Fat FAT or PHAT?
PHAT for sure.
Wow. Yeah, there is a photo that Dee took, and that, I believe, is a cell phone shot.
Yes,
Just to give you an
correct.
idea of how unbelievable that jellyfish was. Look at that.
We were completely caught off guard. And that's how rare sunrise jellyfishes are here at the Cape, is because we know roughly the time frame for a sunset or an evening jelly, in terms of when the light would be most optimal to see one. But we haven't had one at sunrise for so long that I guess it just completely slipped both of our minds. It just caught us completely off guard.
You're not kidding. I mean, look at these. This was definitely not expected. I didn't think so either. But the moment that the first stage kind of curved over and you could see the sunrise over the curve of the Earth, that's usually the indicator of, oh, that is jellyfish conditions. But I didn't want to say anything now that we have the images, though. Goodness gracious, that is freaking awesome.
And the better part about this now too is that for everyone who is waking up nice and early and who is heading to work this morning, if you look towards your east now, we should see a good amount of noctilucent clouds from the exhaust of Falcon 9 against a brightening sky in the morning as the sun is coming up. So always a pretty sight that I always normally forget about as well, but I'm not going to tonight because I can still see it in the sky right now, catching the sun's rays over by between 39A and 39B.
That is absolutely stunning to hear. We've also got people in chat, like Michael Davis, saying they saw the jellyfish in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
See?
Sure, people
Exactly.
along the coast, yeah. If you did get a picture of it or a video of it, please send it to our social media team. You could also tag me on X as well, in
Yep.
addition to NASA Space
Please,
Flight.
please post it. Please tag us. Please tag NSF. Please tag me, Trevor, and Sawyer. We would love to see them. Golly, I forgot how gorgeous sunrise jellies can be.
I think I've only ever seen one, so yeah, they're not very frequent.
It just goes to show, as Max always says, these late night Starlinks hit different.
They do be hitting different. That's right.
And it's, of course, not your ordinary Starlink launch, too, to get that morning jelly. Which, we got someone in chat asking, what typically constitutes jellyfish conditions, though? So, Trevor, what do we usually need to get that jellyfish?
Yeah, so normally, as Max was alluding to a bit ago, on the West Coast, it's right before or right after sunset, right? Where the sun will have set in for people on the ground, but short enough after sunset such that the upper atmosphere is still being illuminated. And that's kind of what makes for these jellyfish effects. And this is the opposite, where the rocket is flying into somewhere that's lit up, whereas where ground is about before ground lights up. So it's just that you kind of need the right time window between launch and sunrise or launch and sunset. I think it's generally an hour, within an hour or so of sunrise or sunset is when you get these really good conditions.
Exactly, and kind of that is depending on how close you are to the actual sunrise portion itself. This one, I believe we were still about 45 minutes away from sunrise here. I also do want to quickly thank Apocalypse Cow, who right before launch gifted 5 Red Team memberships. Thank you so very, very much for gifting those. And of course, I have other people to thank, including you, Max Evans. Thank you for joining us and rolling out bugs and all at this crazy hour.
Hey, despite the treacherous conditions tonight, I guess one could say, it is always a pleasure to come out here and share this experience with all y'all. So, thank you very much for tuning in, and hopefully let's do it again next week.
Turksat 6A would be next up on the list from Pad 40, currently scheduled for July 8th, with the window opening 5:20 p.m. Eastern Time, and also potentially a certain Spaniard getting to see it, but we'll see. Trevor, thank you as well for joining me as my co-host here in the studios.
Of course, good night to all my fellow Americans. Get some much needed sleep.
And to the Europeans, have a great start to your day as well. Because I know for Max, and I also should mention D as well, who is out there getting that early morning gorgeous views there. And Carson, thank you for sticking awake with us as well to help run the stream, push the buttons, and pull the levers, as opposed to a certain Kevin Michael Reed who's just yelling at us in chat. I have been your host, Sawyer Rosenstein. We will see all of you nerds later. Have a great Wednesday, everybody.
And here we go. We have liftoff.
Propulsion continues to be nominal.
R68 chamber pressure looks good.
Traveling up. Roger, planet.
Water towers fly!
Tango down to nominal.
Fighting downside SPD off. Bring in SPD off. It's orange! Orange 45! Oh my god! Oh my god! Equalize! What is it? Put that in the big bag,
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
This methane will be igniting with the flare, correct?
Yikes. You bet. We don't need any more of these.